In class, we've been talking about this idea of linkage disequilibrium. So this is the idea that alleles at two different loci can be physically linked together on the same chromosome. And under certain circumstances, which we discussed in class, particular alleles can be found together. Particular alleles at different loci can be found together more often than you would expect by just throwing alleles together on chromosomes at random based on their allele frequencies in the population. And so in the next two web lectures, we're going to be thinking about some of the implications and applications of this idea of linkage disequilibrium. So in this web lecture, we're going to be thinking about the evolution of sexual reproduction and why linkage disequilibrium is such an important idea and why we even bother having sexual reproduction. And in the next web lecture, we'll be talking about one of the major applications of linkage disequilibrium, and that is in QTL, or quantitative trait locus analysis. So let's start out with the evolution of sex. Sexual reproduction is costly and it's dangerous. So you have to spend time finding a partner to reproduce with. That partner may or may not be willing. They may require additional offerings or investments in order to cooperate. While you're searching for mates, you're vulnerable to predation. You're using up energy that could be spent in finding food. So you might ask the question, why bother with sexual reproduction at all? So what's so great about sex, aside from the obvious? To try to answer this question, an evolutionary biologist named John Maynard Smith created a model that would directly compare, in theory, reproductive success between sexually versus asexually reproducing individuals in the same population. So we're putting them sort of head to head in evolutionary terms and finding out which trait, being a sexually reproducing or being an asexually reproducing individual, will win out in evolutionary terms in terms of greater reproductive output across generations. And so his model was based on two assumptions. The first is that all females, regardless of whether they reproduce sexually or asexually, are going to produce the same number of offspring. The second assumption in this model is that the probability of survival for the offspring does not depend on whether they were produced sexually or asexually. So these two assumptions were made not so much because Maynard Smith thought that they were true, but basically what we'll see is that if both of these assumptions hold, you get a particular result. If that is not the result that we see in the real world, then we have basically just two things that we need to look at that might have been violated so we can figure out which of these assumptions are wrong and in what ways they're wrong. So this is our starting point, kind of our null hypothesis. And here's what Maynard Smith found with this model. Let's compare a sexually reproducing female here with an asexually reproducing female. So obviously the asexually reproducing female is going to produce all females. We're going to assume that the number of offspring each female produces is 4, and so the asexually reproducing female produces 4 more females, 4 daughters, and the sexually reproducing female produces some combination of daughters and sons. So far so good. In the first generation, we are both equal. But let's look at the next generation. Each female produces 4 more females. In the asexually reproducing one, so each of these 4 females produces 4 more genetically identical females. Whereas if we look at the sexually reproducing females, each female produces 4 offspring, but it's a mixture of male and female. So in the next generation, this female is going to produce 4 with some other male. This looks like a cross between siblings, but it doesn't necessarily have to be. This male is going to go off and mate with another female. So the 4 produced by this female is a mixture of males and females again. The 4 produced by this female, again, is going to be a mixture of males and females. This male is going to go off and mate with another female. This female had to find a male to mate with. And so what we see is that in just 2 generations, the asexually reproducing female produces twice as many grandchildren as the sexually reproducing female was able to produce. So basically we have a situation where producing males means that half of the population is not contributing to those 4 offspring in a direct way. Because it takes 2 individuals to produce those 4 offspring, you only get an output that's half as big. So numerically, we expect that asexually reproducing females should outcompete sexually reproducing females exponentially. This is only going to increase exponentially over generations. And that if we're talking about individuals in a single population, the asexually reproducing female is going to win out numerically. The sexually reproducing females are going to be eliminated from the population. So again, what's so great about sex? So let's look at an experiment to begin to think about this and think about these 2 assumptions that John Maynard Smith made. So this is an experiment that compared sexually reproducing beetles. So these are red and black flower beetles. And they were able to set up an experimental situation that simulated asexual reproduction in some of these groups. So let's look at how this works. So they used separate pure breeding populations of red and black flower beetles. That means that all the red ones are red homozygous, all the black ones are black homozygous. And they let one group reproduce normally. So this would be the sexually reproducing group. In the other group, every generation, they threw out all the beetles, each individual, and replaced each of them with 3 new individuals from the source population. So this is going to simulate the reproductive output of asexual reproduction. So this idea that they're going to, on average, produce more offspring than the sexually reproducing ones. Each one is replaced by 3 more. And on average, they'll be genetically identical since they're being taken from the same source population. So they used a control group with no selection. And as predicted by the model, the asexually groups outcompeted the sexual groups every single time. They alternated using the black beetles or the red beetles as the asexual ones. It didn't matter whether the asexual ones were the black beetles or the red beetles. The one that was sexually reproducing always was eliminated from the population. The one that was asexually reproducing took over the entire population. So this is totally consistent with John Maynard Smith's model. But when we introduce some natural selection into the model, they introduced a selective pressure by adding a pesticide to the flower, a sublethal dose, but not very good for the beetles. In every experimental group, the sexually reproducing beetles outcompeted the asexually reproducing one. So there's something about adding selection into the mix here that causes sexual reproduction to have an advantage over asexual reproduction. So the speed with which the asexual beetles went extinct in these populations was proportional to the concentration of the poison, so the strength of selection. So the stronger the selection, the more benefit there is of reproducing sexually as opposed to asexually. So what's going on here? So the second assumption, a female's reproductive mode does not affect the probability that her offspring will survive, often does not hold up, especially under selection. So let's start to think about some of the reasons why that might be. So the only difference between sexual and asexual reproduction at the population genetics level is this combined effect of segregation of alleles, so the fact that you're getting alleles from 2 different unrelated individuals, a mother and a father, and then the recombination of alleles at meiosis. So both of these things are going on in sexual reproduction that causes the patterns of variability in the population to be quite different.